Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter debate here this afternoon on an issue that's increasingly being recognized by Saskatchewan people all across this province, in Swift Current, in Kindersley, and Cypress Hills, Mr. Speaker. Did I mention Cypress Hills, Mr. Speaker? And in every region of the province, all across this fine province. We're speaking to an issue that is very much out of line with the priorities of Saskatchewan people and has people questioning why this government's pushing forward with changes that certainly aren't in the best interests of Saskatchewan people. At the end of this debate here today, or at the end of my introduction of this debate here today, Mr. Speaker, I'll be moving a motion. I'll introduce that motion at this point in time for record, in which I'll be speaking to here today. Motion being, that I would like to move a motion that this Assembly recognizes that spending millions of public dollars on more politicians is unnecessary to effectively represent the current constituents of Saskatchewan, and further, that this Assembly calls on the government to withdraw the measures set forth in Bill number 36 because the government did not consult the people of Saskatchewan before its introduction, and the legislation does not address the common sense priorities of Saskatchewan people. Mr. Speaker, that's the motion we'll be speaking here today, and there's some important points that I'd like to make. What I'd like to say to Saskatchewan people is that I'm incredibly encouraged by the interest that Saskatchewan people are showing in this issue. This circumstance where a government is introducing something that's certainly not in the best interest of Saskatchewan people. And I've been interested with the emails, the phone calls, the petitions that are coming from all across the province, Mr. Speaker. And it's no surprise, Mr. Speaker, it's no surprise when you put forward legislation like this and put forward tricks and maneuvers like this, Mr. Speaker, that Saskatchewan people will be disappointed. It's a matter of being straight with Saskatchewan people, and in this case, this government's been anything but, Mr. Speaker. I know for certain, Mr. Speaker, that when that government went to the people of Saskatchewan in the fall election, Mr. Speaker, with their flashy and sleek brochures, Mr. Speaker, and their platform items, it was never mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that they were going to be increasing the number of politicians in this province, Mr. Speaker. Not a mention to Saskatchewan people in the election, Mr. Speaker. And further to that, Mr. Speaker, not a mention of it in the throne speech, Mr. Speaker, once this government was elected with a large mandate. Now, Mr. Speaker, we accept the choice of voters. We accept that there's a large majority over there, Mr. Speaker. What we don't accept, Mr. Speaker, is for a government to betray Saskatchewan people in the fashion that we have, and for a government to be acting in a manner that's all about their own political partisan best interests, Mr. Speaker, and having no reflection to the best interests of Saskatchewan people. So it's with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, that we oppose this bill. But we also do so, this bill eliminates the voice of children all across this province, of youth, Mr. Speaker. Eliminates youth in the counting of within our constituents and marginalizes that voice, both of children, of youth, students, but also of young communities, Mr. Speaker, of First Nations Métis communities, Mr. Speaker. And this is something that's certainly not just something that the opposition is identifying. We're proud to stand up to make sure that the voices of children and students and youth are represented here in this chamber. We believe they should also be front and centre in the electoral decisions made, Mr. Speaker. We also believe that they should be a full consideration in the budgetary decisions of government, and any move to discount that voice, Mr. Speaker, is an injustice. And we agree, Mr. Speaker, with the Children's Advocate, Mr. Speaker, who's come out scathing this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note that the Children's Advocate in Saskatchewan is an independent role, Mr. Speaker, a non-partisan role, there for the best interests of Saskatchewan children. The Children's Advocate, Mr. Speaker, and I quote that independent provincial Children's Advocate, to eliminate those under 18 of the eligibility runs contrary to everyone's right to equal representation. Every citizen has the right to effective representation, end quote, and period, Mr. Speaker. You know, listen, there is no valid reason to exclude the voices of children. What we should be doing as children, youth, and students is reaching out to youth and young people and young communities and engaging them in the democratic process, inviting them in to be part of the solutions of today that are going to secure the bright future of tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. To not do so and to, in fact, dismiss discount and marginalize that voice, as we're seeing here, Mr. Speaker, only for the political best interests of their own party, Mr. Speaker, is a sad day in Saskatchewan. This week, we've celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Speaker. The Charter guarantees effective representation, Mr. Speaker, and we see the actions of this government running counter to both the Charter, Mr. Speaker, and its intent, but also to the best interests of Saskatchewan young people all across this province, just as been highlighted by the Children's Advocate, who says it runs contrary to everyone's right to equal representation, Mr. Speaker. It's sad, Mr. Speaker, and this is discrimination simply based on age, Mr. Speaker. Incredibly disappointing. What I know is interesting, many people highlight as well, is that in fact we aren't underrepresented in Saskatchewan at all, Mr. Speaker. I know I've had people from L'Orange make contact. We've had people from Kindersley make contact. We've had people from Meadow Lake and Lloydminster make contact, Mr. Speaker. And what they're suggesting, Mr. Speaker, what they're highlighting is that in fact we already have one of the smallest constituencies by way of population here in this province, Mr. Speaker, than the rest of Canada. So they're wondering why this government's pursuing big government for politicians, Mr. Speaker, to spend millions of dollars to pursue the best interests, their own political partisan interests, Mr. Speaker, instead of placing those priorities, those resources, Mr. Speaker, into the best interests of Saskatchewan people. When they're looking, Mr. Speaker, I know some of the folks, I was chatting with this gentleman up in Melville who gave me a phone call, and he had gone online and he had looked at the information. He wanted to just make sure what he was looking at was correct. This individual, as he described to me, doesn't make these kinds of phone calls usually, Mr. Speaker. In fact, he described himself as somebody who, well, I'll be frank, Mr. Speaker, he said he didn't vote for our party last election, and that's fine. We work for all people, Mr. Speaker. But when he looked at the literature, Mr. Speaker, and he looked at the numbers, Mr. Speaker, he wanted to clarify, because he thought the numbers couldn't be right. Because he said any government in a right mind with an eye to fairness and serving Saskatchewan people simply couldn't be doing what this government is in fact and indeed doing, Mr. Speaker, in adding 3 more politicians by spending millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, people's hard-earned dollars, Mr. Speaker, at the same time as they're piling expenses onto the backs of everyday families all across this province, asking seniors to dig deeper, Mr. Speaker, into their pockets to pay for prescription drugs and other costs of living increases, Mr. Speaker, and that's a sad day, Mr. Speaker. A sad day, and it reflects misplaced priorities. What this individual highlighted, and the questions, it was a chart, Mr. Speaker, that highlighted the different provinces and how they relate to the number of constituents within a constituency, Mr. Speaker. I believe, in fact, he was referencing and been on a Canadian Taxpayers Federation website, Mr. Speaker, that put out a bit of a video, I guess, on this, Mr. Speaker, highlighting some of this information, and certainly I understand they strongly oppose this reckless move that's certainly not in the best interest of Saskatchewan people or the tax-paying public. But the individual, what he wanted to raise with me is just, how can this be? How can this be that British Columbia, Mr. Speaker, their constituencies by way of population, an MLA in British Columbia has 2.9 more MLAs or more constituents than we do, Mr. Speaker, almost 3 times more. So here in Saskatchewan, we serve roughly 18,000 constituents, Mr. Speaker. In British Columbia, an MLA serves 51,764 constituents, Mr. Speaker. Almost 3 times as many, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know Saskatchewan people pretty well, Mr. Speaker, and there's a special spirit and work ethic about Saskatchewan people, a certain part of their DNA that say we can roll up our sleeves, we can work a little harder, and we can tend to what we need to do, that we can determine our own future, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I have certainly not come across a single individual that somehow thinks that we need to create a cushier environment for politicians, Mr. Speaker. That's simply not the DNA of Saskatchewan people. What I urge, Mr. Speaker, is for members opposite to work a little harder, Mr. Speaker. And that's a shared piece that we can all do, Mr. Speaker. And that's what Saskatchewan people expect. But now, it's not just British Columbia, Mr. Speaker, that is in this circumstance. In Alberta, Mr. Speaker, when we have only 18,000 people in our constituencies, in Alberta we have they have 43,915 constituents, Mr. Speaker. Wow. 2.5 times more than we do, Mr. Speaker. Repeat that. The member from Cumberland says that maybe I should repeat that. That's 2.5 times more constituents, Mr. Speaker. When we look at Ontario, Mr. Speaker, in Ontario, Mr. Speaker, they actually have 6.7 times the number of constituents in their ridings, Mr. Speaker. So here in Saskatchewan, when the Sask Party is saying, oh boy, we can't keep up with keeping in touch with 18,000 people, Mr. Speaker, in Ontario, they serve more than 120,000 constituents, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to go, to have constituencies that large, Mr. Speaker, but it proves to serve a good point when you see members opposite with a little bit of population growth that's going on in the province, something that we're encouraged by, something we've seen for a long time, Mr. Speaker, but to somehow pretend that we need to crank up the number of MLAs. Even with the population growth, Mr. Speaker, we have the smallest constituencies by way of population in the country, Mr. Speaker, and that's a disconnect from the way Saskatchewan people are wired and what they expect from us as politicians, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'll tell you this, Mr. Speaker, I've been on lots of doorsteps, Mr. Speaker, and we go out to meetings all across Saskatchewan, we hear from Saskatchewan people, and I can honestly tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I have never heard a single person tell me that we need more politicians, Mr. Speaker, other than the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, and now a couple of their rabid supporters, Mr. Speaker. But most of their supporters in that last election say this is wrong. This is wrong. It isn't what they were offered. It isn't what they were promised, and it's out of line with the priorities of Saskatchewan people. And, Mr. Speaker, I can highlight the discussions that I've had on doorsteps all through my riding, Mr. Speaker, and you know, there's good discussions around tuition, around cost of living, around housing, around education, around health services, Mr. Speaker. Never has a single person mentioned to me that they want to increase the number of politicians. You know, and Mr. Speaker, it just goes to the point that it just doesn't pass the common sense test. And this speaks to what I've said about the priorities of Saskatchewan people. So we're greatly concerned with this bill. It doesn't serve Saskatchewan people. It serves the partisan interests of a government, Mr. Speaker, a government that I think Saskatchewan people wish would have focused on the mandate that they had been offered, and maybe move forward in a humble way, Mr. Speaker, as a large majority, Mr. Speaker, instead of losing sight of what they maybe had been elected on or what they had been telling voters before, hearing from all Saskatchewan people or from many Saskatchewan people that there seems to be a change in this government from the election until now, Mr. Speaker, that there seems to be a disconnect and a lack of understanding of the realities Saskatchewan families are facing, Mr. Speaker, a bit of an out-of-touch nature of this government in the short few months, pushing forward and a bill like this that is all about them, Mr. Speaker, and costs Saskatchewan people lots of money, and at the same time does nothing to serve the best interests of Saskatchewan people. We're disappointed with this piece of legislation. We're disappointed because it's needlessly spending millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, to increase the number of politicians. We're disappointed because it marginalizes and takes away the voice of young people all across this province when we need to be including and taking actions to figure out how to include young people more and more and more in their democratic process and in the decisions that will be made to ensure their bright future and our bright future as a province, Mr. Speaker. This is a piece of legislation that was put forward without any consultation, Mr. Speaker. It runs counter, Mr. Speaker, to what the Children's Advocate, the independent, non-partisan Children's Advocate here in Saskatchewan is telling the government, who's saying this is wrong, that it takes away the voice of children, Mr. Speaker. And for all these reasons, we strongly oppose this piece of legislation, and we call on this government to withdraw, to pull this reckless bill that's all about them, Mr. Speaker, and nothing about Saskatchewan people. And so, Mr. Speaker, with that, I would like to move a motion that this Assembly recognizes that spending millions of public dollars on more politicians is unnecessary to effectively represent the current constituents of Saskatchewan, and further, that this Assembly calls on the government to withdraw the measures set forth in Bill number 36 because the government did not consult the people of Saskatchewan before its introduction, and the legislation does not address the common sense priorities of Saskatchewan people. Mr. Speaker, that's the motion I put before the Assembly for debate here today. We strongly oppose the bill that's been put forward, strongly support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.